It was upon a mist-laden morning in late October of the year 1891 that I first heard of the curious affair, which Holmes later referred to as the most eloquent silence in the annals of crime. London lay shrouded beneath a dull grey fog, the kind that muffles the rattle of carriage wheels and renders even the gas lamps little more than blurred halos in the gloom. I was seated at our breakfast table in Baker Street, perusing the Times, when my companion emerged from his room, dressing gown loosely tied, his keen eyes already alight with that peculiar spark of mental animation which invariably heralded a new case. Without a word of greeting, he crossed to the fireplace and picked up a sealed envelope that had been placed upon the mantel. "Delivered by hand not 20 minutes ago," Mrs. Hudson had told me. It was addressed in an elegant, slanted hand, simply to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes broke the seal, glanced through the contents, and a faint smile flickered across his features. "Watson," said he, tossing the letter across the table, "how would you define a man who is struck speechless by the written word?" I read the note eagerly. It was penned on thick cream stationery, bearing the crest of the Blackwell Literary Society, a venerable institution of London men of letters. The message was brief and tremulous. "Mr. Holmes, I implore your immediate assistance. A terrible event has occurred within our society. Our most esteemed member, Sir Reginald Brooke, was discovered dead in his study last evening. There is no sign of violence, no poison detected, no struggle, and yet, beside his lifeless body, lies a page half-written, the pen dropped from his grasp and the ink upon it, curiously dry though the room was sealed. Scotland Yard is at a loss. Pray come at once. Lionel Greaves, Secretary, Blackwell Literary Society." Holmes had already donned his coat. "You observe, Watson," said he, "that our correspondent writes of a pen that ceased to write before its time. That in itself is most singular." "You suspect foul play?" I asked, rising. "I suspect," he replied, "that death has found a most unorthodox accomplice." Within half an hour we were en route to St. James's Square, where the Blackwell Literary Society occupied a dignified Georgian building. The fog clung to the railings like damp cobwebs, and the echo of our footsteps was the only sound upon the deserted street. Mr. Lionel Greaves, a nervous, bespectacled gentleman in his middle years, greeted us with evident relief. "Thank heavens you have come, Mr. Holmes. The yard has been and gone, Inspector Lestrade himself, though he left quite bewildered." Holmes inclined his head. "The most productive state for a policeman, in my experience." We were led through a richly carpeted corridor into Sir Reginald Brooke's private study. The air still carried a faint odour of stale ink and extinguished fire. Upon a mahogany writing desk lay a single sheet of paper, half filled with neat but faltering handwriting. The pen, a fine silver-tipped fountain model, rested on its side, the nib dry. Sir Reginald himself was slumped in a high-backed chair, his expression curiously serene. Holmes's eyes darted over every inch of the room. He noted the arrangement of the bookshelves, the ink bottle, the half-open window latch, and a small blot of ink upon the carpet a few inches from the desk. He stooped, examined the blot through his lens, and made a low sound of satisfaction. "Lestrade believes it to be heart failure," said Greaves, wringing his hands. But Sir Reginald was in perfect health. "Heart failure may claim a man," Holmes murmured, "but it seldom dries his ink before his hand leaves the page." Watson's narration could not help but note the glint in Holmes's eyes, that sharp, almost predatory light that came when the scent of mystery was fresh. He moved to the window, traced a finger along the sill, and glanced toward the ceiling, where a faint watermark spread outward like a pale flower. "A curious discoloration," said he softly. "Watson, note it down. It may have more to say than our deceased author." Then, turning suddenly to Greaves, he asked, "Who had access to this room after Sir Reginald retired here last evening?" "Only the Society's members," replied the secretary, "but none entered after he began writing. We all dined together at 8. He excused himself, saying he must complete a letter of importance." "A letter," Holmes repeated thoughtfully, his eyes fixed upon the unfinished page. "A letter that may never have been meant to reach its reader." He lifted the sheet carefully with his tweezers and examined the writing. The final line stopped mid-sentence. "My dear friend, if you value your life as I value truth, you must—" Holmes replaced the page, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said quietly, "it appears the good Sir Reginald had something of considerable urgency to impart, but someone, it seems, preferred that his pen remain silent." Holmes stood for a moment longer over the body, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes narrowing in deep concentration. The silence of the study was broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock, its rhythm echoing through the heavy air. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, Holmes motioned for me to examine the corpse. "You see, Watson, there is no sign of struggle, no contusion, no mark of external injury. Observe the pallor of the skin, not the blue tinge of suffocation, nor the livid hue of poison. And yet," he leaned closer, "there is an odd rigidity about the fingers, as though the hand clenched at the pen with unnatural force." I bent down and saw at once what he meant. Sir Reginald's right hand had not merely dropped the pen, it appeared almost frozen mid-grasp, the fingers slightly contorted. "Rigor mortis, perhaps," I ventured. Holmes shook his head. "No, my dear fellow, rigor could not set in so soon, not when, according to Mr. Greaves, the man was found scarcely an hour after retiring to this room. You will note, too, that the ink upon the pen's nib is dry. Curious, is it not, that ink should dry so swiftly in a sealed room on a damp October night?" Mr. Greaves shifted uneasily. I cannot imagine what that signifies, Mr. Holmes. The police said nothing of it." Holmes's lips twitched faintly. "Lestrade, though diligent, has never been on intimate terms with ink." He turned away from the desk and began pacing the carpet in slow, measured strides, his gaze darting from the hearth to the window, from the bookcase to the wastebasket beside the chair. Every few seconds he would pause, tilt his head and resume his silent scrutiny. "Tell me, Mr. Greaves," he said at last, "was Sir Reginald a man of orderly habits?" "Impeccably so," Greaves replied. "His study was always kept in perfect condition. He abhorred disarray." "Then it is all the more noteworthy," Holmes murmured, "that one of the volumes on his shelf lies slightly askew." He stepped forward, running a finger along the row of leather-bound tomes until he reached a slim book titled Essays on Moral Logic. Pulling it gently free, he turned it over in his hands and, after a moment's inspection, withdrew a small folded paper from between its pages. The secretary gasped. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I had no knowledge—" "Calm yourself," said Holmes. "It is not yet a hanging matter to own a secret." He unfolded the paper, revealing a brief message written in a cramped, hurried script. "If the truth comes to light, none of us shall be safe." There was no signature. Holmes studied the paper intently, holding it near the lamp. "Watson, do you note the peculiar sheen?" "Yes," I said. "It glistens faintly, though the ink seems ordinary." "Precisely. And yet, when exposed to this heat, observe." He held the page nearer to the flame. At once, faint letters appeared beneath the visible writing, ghostly and delicate as breath upon glass. "Tonight at the Society's library, midnight." Holmes smiled thinly. "An appointment, it would seem, and one, I dare say, that was kept." Before Greaves could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and the door opened to admit Inspector Lestrade himself, his familiar bulldog expression betraying both fatigue and frustration. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, still sniffing about, I see," he said with an air of forced good humor. "A sad business, this. Gentleman dies at his desk. Heart failure, no doubt. Doctor from Harley Street confirmed it." "Indeed," said Holmes dryly. "And did this medical luminary explain how heart failure dries ink, Inspector?" Lestrade frowned. "Dries ink?" "Exactly so. You will observe that the ink upon the pen and the page is as arid as the Egyptian desert, though every other surface here bears the sheen of moisture. You may also have missed this little scrap of paper, which appears to speak of midnight meetings and dangerous truths." Lestrade scowled, clearly nettled. "You'll have your mystery if you like, Mr. Holmes, but I'm satisfied. There's no sign of foul play, no wound, and the servants swear no one entered or left this room after 10 o'clock. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then, my dear Lestrade, I shall take the liberty of being unsatisfied on your behalf." He turned again to the desk. His hand hovered above the ink bottle, then withdrew sharply. "Watson, look closely at this ink. Do you perceive any sediment?" I examined it. The liquid was strangely clear, lacking the faint cloudiness of common writing fluid. Remarkably transparent, I said. As though filtered, or tampered with, Holmes added softly. Note, too, that its odor is slightly acrid, an aroma not of carbon ink but of something more chemical. I would wager that this is no ordinary ink at all. He replaced the bottle and straightened, his eyes now gleaming. Watson, fetch my small glass vial from the pocket of my coat. I shall take a sample for analysis. As I did so, Lestrade folded his arms impatiently. Always your infernal bottles and powders, Holmes. You'll be telling me next the man was killed by a pen. Perhaps not by the pen, Holmes murmured, sealing the vial carefully, but certainly through it. Mr. Greaves, pale as paper, stammered, You mean poison? Holmes gave no answer, merely adjusted his hat and glanced once more around the study. When was the last time anyone saw Sir Reginald alive? Just before dinner, Greaves said. He appeared distracted but perfectly well. And who dined with him? There were 5 of us. Sir Reginald, myself, Mrs. Clara Brooke, his sister, Mr. Ambrose Fenton, our treasurer, and Miss Eleanor Vale, a visiting novelist. Holmes's brows lifted slightly. A novelist, you say? Then the society keeps mixed company. Tell me, was there any disagreement at table? Greaves hesitated. A minor exchange between Sir Reginald and Mr. Fenton. Something about the society's funds, I believe. But it was quickly smoothed over. Holmes smiled. Money and words, the 2 eternal provocations to mischief. Very good. I shall wish to speak with all of them. Lestrade sighed. They've all been questioned already, Holmes. You'll hear the same thing I did. No quarrel, no disturbance, and no sign of anyone entering this room. Then you may rest easy, Inspector, Holmes replied. For if no one entered, the answer must already be within. He turned toward the door, signaling that our work there was done for the moment. As we stepped into the corridor, the murmur of distant conversation reached us from the drawing-room, where the society's remaining members had gathered. Their faces, when we entered, were a study in varying shades of apprehension. Holmes paused at the threshold, his gaze sweeping the room. Mrs. Clara Brooke sat erect and composed, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Fenton, a stout florid man, drummed his fingers on a cane, while Miss Vale, striking in dark green silk, watched Holmes with undisguised curiosity. Holmes bowed slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, permit me to intrude upon your grief for a brief inquiry. I promise to be neither long nor gentle. A nervous laugh fluttered from someone in the corner. Holmes took a seat, steepled his fingers once more, and looked from one face to the next. Each of you, he said quietly, knew Sir Reginald better than most. Tell me, what was he writing when death found him? A pause followed. Then Miss Vale answered softly, He mentioned a letter. A private one. He said it might expose certain matters within the society. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed, and now the letter lies unfinished. Curious, is it not, how death so often intervenes at the moment of revelation? He rose then, his coat sweeping behind him. Watson, I believe our next course is clear. We must learn what words were meant to fill that silence, and who most feared they might be written. And with that Holmes strode toward the door, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the low murmur of unease left in his wake. Holmes did not speak as we stepped once more into the mist-swathed street. The night air had thickened into a damp fog that coiled through the lamplight like pale smoke, and I could barely make out his sharp profile beside me as we walked toward a waiting hansom. Only when we had settled within and the horse had begun its steady trot did Holmes finally break his silence. Watson, he said quietly, have you observed the one constant in every man's deceit? I cannot say that I have. It is this. He hides the truth in the most visible of places. Sir Reginald's killer, I suspect, has done precisely that. You believe it murder, then? He glanced sidelong at me, his eyes gleaming through the foggy glass. My dear fellow, a man may die by nature's hand, but ink does not dry by divine intervention. Something or someone hastened both. We rode on in silence. I could see that Holmes's mind was already leaping several steps ahead, weaving unseen connections. He tapped his long fingers rhythmically on his knee, his lips moving in faint murmurs I could not hear. When we arrived back at Baker Street, he bounded from the cab with the restless energy that came only when his intellect was fully roused. Within moments, our sitting room was alive with the familiar ritual. Chemical flasks steaming on the sideboard, test tubes glimmering in lamplight, and Holmes bent over the work table with sleeves rolled to the elbows. He held the vial of ink collected from the society and added a few drops of reagent, watching intently as the mixture shifted in color from jet black to a murky violet. "Ah," he exclaimed, "as I thought. Watson, would you step closer?" I obeyed, peering into the glass beaker. "This ink," Holmes explained, "contains an admixture of glycoside extract, a rare compound derived from the foxglove plant, Digitalis purpurea. In moderate doses, it slows the heart. In excess, it arrests it altogether. A minute trace would suffice if administered through the skin, say, by a small wound or, more elegantly, through prolonged contact with a pen." "You mean the poison was within the ink itself?" "Precisely. Observe the faint residue that clings to the silver nib. Sir Reginald's habit of licking the pen tip to clear clots would have delivered the toxin directly. Ingenious, almost poetic in its cruelty. The weapon that captured his words became the instrument of his silence. I shuddered at the thought. Then whoever tampered with the ink knew both chemistry and Sir Reginald's habits intimately." "Indeed," Holmes said, "which narrows our field considerably. Only those who had regular access to his study or to the ink he used could manage such a subtle substitution." He began to pace again, his dressing gown billowing behind him like a shadow. Mr. Greaves, as secretary, certainly handled the society's correspondence. But his agitation today seemed genuine, nervous fear rather than guilt. Fenton, the treasurer, is of course a stock. His quarrel over funds may mask a darker motive. Yet Mrs. Clara Brooke's composure troubles me most. Too calm, Watson, too immaculate. Grief wears many masks, but serenity is rarely among them. He stopped abruptly. "And the novelist, Miss Eleanor Vale. Did you mark her eyes when I mentioned the unfinished letter? She betrayed not surprise but curiosity. That woman knows more than she dares confess. You think she might be involved?" Holmes shrugged. "Involved, yes. Guilty, not yet. A writer trades in imagination, but imagination, when misused, may serve deceit as readily as art." He returned to his work table, scribbling quick notes on a scrap of paper. "There is one further test I must conduct. The presence of digitalis explains the means, but the method of introduction remains uncertain. If Sir Reginald's ink was poisoned, then a fresh bottle must have been provided shortly before his death." Holmes lifted a small magnifying lens and examined the glass vial of ink again. "The seal on this bottle is unbroken. Curious, meaning the fatal mixture came from his own desk, his personal supply." He turned suddenly, his eyes alight. "Watson, the society's servants. They would know who last attended Sir Reginald's study before his death. Tomorrow morning we shall return to St. James's Square." Sleep was impossible that night. Holmes remained awake, conducting silent experiments and jotting cryptic notes into his casebook. The following morning, we found ourselves once again before the grand facade of the Blackwell Literary Society. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the morning light revealed the building's worn stone more clearly, the windows glittering with dew. Mr. Greaves met us at the door, his anxiety undiminished. "Mr. Holmes, I am relieved you have returned. There has been a development." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Indeed?" "Yes. Miss Vale did not return home last night. Her landlady reports she left the building near midnight and has not been seen since." Holmes's mouth curved into that half-smile I knew so well. "How convenient for her, and for us an opportunity. Watson, we are now dealing not with a mystery but a game of pursuit." He swept past Greaves into the corridor and made straight for the study. Nothing had been disturbed since the previous evening. The scent of stale air and old ink still lingered. Holmes knelt once more beside the desk, this time inspecting the underside. After a few moments he gave a low cry of satisfaction. "Look here, Watson. Someone has recently replaced this drawer lining. The glue is not yet fully set." With delicate precision he lifted the false panel. Beneath it lay a crumpled scrap of stationery, identical to that upon the desk. On it were only 4 words scrawled in haste. "Ink switched. Fenton knows." Holmes's gaze darkened. "So Fenton again." "The plot thickens like the London fog." Greaves uttered a weak exclamation. "Good heavens! You cannot mean Mr. Fenton poisoned him?" "Mean, no," said Holmes evenly. "Suspect?" "Most assuredly." He replaced the drawer and rose to his full height. "Where might I find our treasurer this morning?" "In his lodgings off Charing Cross," Greaves said faintly. "Excellent. Watson, your hat. We go at once." The hansom rattled through the busy streets as the city came to life around us. Holmes sat silent, eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile at his lips. I knew the signs well. His mind was arranging facts as a musician arranges notes into harmony. When we arrived, the maid who answered the door told us Mr. Fenton had gone out early, saying he had business at his club. But Holmes's gaze drifted to a smear of black upon the door handle. He touched it with a gloved finger and lifted it to the light. "Ink again," he murmured. "And fresh. The same peculiar sheen. It seems Mr. Fenton carries traces of his own guilt." We found him soon enough, seated in the reading room of the Pall Mall Club, a cigar smouldering between his thick fingers. The moment Holmes entered, Fenton's ruddy complexion paled. "Good morning, Mr. Fenton," Holmes said pleasantly. "I hope your correspondence proceeds less fatally than Sir Reginald's." The man started violently. "What do you mean by that, sir?" "Only that your late associate's pen wrote its last under curious circumstances, circumstances which your name, it appears, cannot escape." Fenton blustered, his hands trembling. "You've no right to accuse me. I've done nothing wrong." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Then you will not object, I trust, if we examine your hands." Before the man could react, Holmes seized his wrist, turning the palm upward. A faint stain, nearly invisible, clung to the crease between thumb and forefinger, a dark trace that the casual eye might have missed. Holmes produced a small phial and dabbed at the mark with a reagent. It bloomed instantly into a deep violet hue. "As I feared," he said quietly. "Watson, digitalis residue." And so our man who handled the ink now trembles at the memory of it. Fenton's face drained of color. For a moment I thought he might collapse. "Sir Reginald discovered your thefts from the Society's accounts," Holmes continued coldly. "He intended to expose you in that letter, hence your desperate remedy. You exchanged his ink with a poisoned batch, relying upon his nightly habit to seal your silence. But there is one flaw you could not foresee." Fenton's lips moved soundlessly. What flaw?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That a writer, however skilled, seldom finishes a letter without leaving a trace of his intention, and that my dear sir, read truth even in unfinished words." He turned to me then, his expression grave but satisfied. "Watson, send for Lestrade. I believe our affair of the silent pen is ready to speak." Fenton's trembling hands tightened upon the arms of his chair, his eyes darting from Holmes to myself like a trapped animal seeking an escape. The bustling murmur of the club seemed to fade, and I could hear the faint rattle of the man's unsteady breath. His defiance, such as it was, flickered weakly against Holmes's unrelenting calm. "You think yourself clever, Holmes," he muttered hoarsely. "You weave your tales well, but you have no proof, none. I may have touched that ink, yes, perhaps I did, but that proves nothing of murder." Holmes regarded him steadily, his voice level but edged with steel. "Proof, Mr. Fenton, is seldom a single blow. It is rather a tapestry woven from 1,000 threads. Allow me to display a few." He drew from his pocket the small vial of ink he had taken from Sir Reginald's desk. "This bottle contains the same toxin now blooming upon your hands. You handled it recently, very recently. I need not ask how, for the evidence speaks for itself. And you left your mark again upon the handle of your door this morning, betraying that your conscience or your nerves would not permit you a clean escape." Fenton's mouth opened, but Holmes silenced him with an upraised hand. "Still, I grant you this. Guilt alone does not constitute murder. You may protest that you merely replaced a bottle by accident. But here lies the fatal point. You knew of Sir Reginald's habit of moistening his pen with his lips, a habit you jested about more than once. As I have learned from Mr. Greaves, you replaced that ink knowing what its contact would bring." Fenton surged to his feet, face flushed with anger. "You can't prove I knew. You twist every word to suit your fancy." Holmes' eyes glinted dangerously. "And yet, Mr. Fenton, I can prove something more damning still. You were not alone in this enterprise." The room seemed to contract around us. I saw Fenton's defiance falter for a moment, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face. Holmes continued, his tone low and deliberate. "A clever crime, you see, is seldom the work of a single mind. Your accounting discrepancies, yes, they drew suspicion, but they were child's play compared to this murder. You had help. Someone provided you with the means, perhaps even urged you on, promising discretion for a share of your silence. That someone, I suspect, was Miss Eleanor Vale. At the mention of the name, Fenton's head jerked upward. "Vale?" he gasped. "You've no idea what you're saying." Holmes's expression softened into something almost resembling pity. "On the contrary, I have every idea. Miss Vale's disappearance following Sir Reginald's death was no coincidence. She had cause to flee, cause born not of guilt alone, but of fear. Tell me, Mr. Fenton, did she not supply the ink?" Fenton's lips trembled, and he sank back into his chair, his hands clutching at the edge of the table. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a groan, he buried his face in his hands. "She told me it was harmless," he said in a muffled voice. "She said it would only make him ill, frighten him into silence. She swore it would not kill." Holmes's expression did not change, though I could see the quick gleam of comprehension in his eyes. "Ah, then you confirm my suspicion." I didn't mean for him to die," Fenton went on, his words tumbling over each other in disarray. "I was desperate. Reginald had discovered everything, the missing funds, the falsified ledgers. He threatened to bring it before the entire society. I would have been ruined." She offered to help to save us both. Said she had access to a certain compound through one of her acquaintances at a chemist's. I didn't know it would do this. "Her acquaintance," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "A convenient phrase, Mr. Fenton, but I fear your accomplice knew exactly what it would do." I felt a chill run through me. The image of Miss Vale, composed, watchful, with that faintly amused smile, rose vividly in my mind. There had been something about her, an intelligence too cool, too deliberate for innocence. Holmes drew on his gloves. "Come, Watson. Inspector Lestrade will be delighted to receive Mr. Fenton and his confession. But our work is not yet finished. The hand that mixed this ink still writes freely, and I mean to read its signature." Lestrade arrived within the hour, and, though at first skeptical, he was soon overwhelmed by the clarity of Holmes's deductions and the trembling testimony of Fenton himself. The treasurer was led away, a broken figure, protesting that he had been misled by the woman's assurances. Yet Holmes, for all his composure, seemed dissatisfied. He remained at the window of the club's reading room long after Fenton had gone, staring into the London haze with a distant, brooding expression. "Watson," he said at last, "there is something exquisite and sinister about this design. Fenton is but the instrument, not the composer. The lady holds the pen." We took a cab once more into the city, Holmes directing the driver with brisk precision. "Miss Vale," he mused aloud, "has vanished into thin air, yet London is a vast net, and even the cleverest fish cannot swim its currents unseen." Her landlady spoke of a man visiting her on occasion, a physician, or so he claimed. We shall begin there, after some inquiry, and the judicious application of Holmes's network of informants. We found our way to a modest apothecary's shop in Bloomsbury, its signboard faintly swinging in the wind. Within, the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and spirits of ammonia. A thin, scholarly-looking man emerged from behind the counter, his spectacles glinting. "Good day," Holmes said cheerfully. "We are making inquiries regarding Miss Eleanor Vale. I understand she was a client of yours." The apothecary hesitated. "Miss Vale?" "Yes, indeed. A woman of refined intellect. She often sought rare tinctures for her writing, ink mixtures, exotic compounds. A remarkable mind, though perhaps a restless one." Holmes's tone was conversational, almost casual. "Would one of those tinctures by chance have contained an extract of digitalis?" The man blinked, startled. "Why, yes. At her request, I prepared a diluted solution some weeks ago. She claimed it was for botanical research. She even showed me her notebook, pages upon pages of meticulous notes." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You still have this notebook?" I believe she took it when she last visited. About a week ago." Holmes thanked the man and left his card, promising to return. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted through the narrow street, gilding the cobblestones. Holmes stood still for a moment, deep in thought, then said softly, "Watson, do you recall Sir Reginald's final words upon the page? 'If you value your life as I value truth, you must—'" "Yes," I said. "They remain unfinished. Perhaps not as unfinished as we thought. What if he meant to warn his correspondent, Miss Vale herself? A man like Brooke would not threaten exposure without conscience. He may have sought to save her, not condemn her. Then she killed to silence mercy." Holmes's gaze was distant. "Not mercy, Watson, fear. For in every artist lies the terror of revelation. She may have feared that he knew something of her past, something more deadly than forgery or theft. He hailed another cab, his energy rekindled. We shall pay a visit to her lodgings once more. I believe she has not fled as far as she wishes us to think. The drive was brief and silent. As we approached the building, the lamplighter was making his rounds, casting warm halos through the gathering fog. The landlady, startled to see us again, led us upstairs to Miss Vale's room. The door was locked from within. Holmes motioned her back, produced a slender tool from his pocket, and within seconds the lock clicked open. The room was dim and faintly scented with lilac. Papers lay strewn upon the desk, and beside them stood a small trunk half-packed as though in haste. On the table was an open notebook, filled with intricate sketches of chemical apparatus and literary drafts mingled strangely together. But what drew Holmes's immediate attention was a small bottle half empty, its contents a deep violet hue. He lifted it delicately. "Digitalis ink," he murmured, and the final verse of her confession. For on the page before it were the words, written in her elegant, steady hand, "Art and death, each demands the hand steady and the heart still. If truth be poison, then let me taste it first." Holmes exhaled softly. "Watson, she has chosen her own verdict." And even as he spoke, my eyes fell upon the figure slumped in the corner chair, her face pale as parchment, a pen fallen from her fingers. For a long moment, silence filled the small room. The soft flicker of the lamplight threw wavering shadows across Miss Vale's still form, and the faint scent of lilac clung to the air like a ghost of her presence. Holmes stood unmoving, the empty bottle in his hand, his eyes fixed upon the woman who had once woven words and poison with the same deft precision. I could hear the distant rumble of carriage wheels from the street below, muffled and unreal, as though the world itself had drawn a curtain over her final act. "Holmes," I murmured. "She's gone." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Watson, and with her passing a chapter closes, but not before leaving us a few lines yet to decipher." He placed the bottle gently on the table and bent over the open notebook. "Observe, her final entry is more than poetic flourish. She describes proportions, chemical measures, and adjustments to the tincture. There is method here, even in despair. She meant to perfect her art, to make her death a final experiment." I shuddered. "A dreadful kind of art, Holmes. Indeed, but the most revealing kind." He turned a few pages, scanning her careful script. "See here, references to the manuscript to Truth Unbound, and this, Sir Reginald's discovery must not see daylight. The ink must silence it. That, Watson, is our final clue." I leaned closer, frowning. "You believe she murdered him to conceal a manuscript?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "Precisely. Brooke was more than a critic. He was a man of moral discipline. He may have unearthed evidence of her earlier crimes, perhaps plagiarism or blackmail committed under another name. She was a literary ghost, Watson, a woman who lived by words not her own. When Brooke threatened exposure, she answered in the only language she knew, deception inked in death." As he spoke, he closed the notebook and slipped it into his coat. "We must deliver this to Scotland Yard, but first a small courtesy to the dead." He stepped toward Miss Vale and drew the shawl from the back of the chair, draping it gently over her shoulders. For all his razor intellect, there was a quiet reverence in the gesture, a recognition that tragedy, however earned, was still human. The police arrived within the hour, summoned discreetly by the landlady at Holmes's request. Lestrade entered with his usual mixture of briskness and awe, glancing from Holmes to the body and then to the array of papers scattered across the desk. "Another one of your cases, eh, Mr. Holmes?" he said grimly. "Poison again?" "Poison and pride, Inspector," Holmes replied softly. "A rare but fatal combination. You will find in that notebook the confession of a woman who feared discovery more than damnation. She took her own life by the same means she dealt to another, digitalis dissolved in writing ink." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "I'll have it all brought in, sir. Strange, though, to see one so clever end like this." "Cleverness, unguided by conscience," Holmes said, "is like a razor in the hands of a child. So it cuts deepest where it was meant to heal." As we descended the narrow stairway into the cool night air, I could feel the weight of the evening pressing upon us. Holmes walked in silence, his face shadowed, his hands clasped behind his back. The fog was thick now, swirling under the lamplight, and the city moved about us like some great living machine, indifferent to death or justice. At last I broke the silence. You seem troubled, Holmes. The case is complete, the truth known, the guilty found. What remains? He glanced sidelong at me. Does truth ever complete itself, Watson? I find myself wondering whether we uncovered it, or merely exposed one of its disguises. Miss Vale killed, yes, but she was not born wicked. She was shaped, moulded by the hunger of her craft and the cruelty of circumstance. London devours its dreamers, and she was among its most delicate. I was silent for a time. Holmes seldom spoke so, and when he did it was with the weary insight of a man who saw too much of the world's machinery and too little of its mercy. We reached Baker Street past midnight. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet, had left a fire burning low in the grate. Holmes removed his coat, tossed the notebook upon the table, and took up his violin. For several minutes he played softly, a haunting melody that seemed to hover between sorrow and reflection. The notes lingered like the ghost of a confession not meant for mortal ears. When at last he lowered the bow, I said quietly, "You feel for her." Holmes did not answer at once. He stared into the fire, the orange light flickering across his sharp features. In a manner of speaking, she was a criminal, yes, but also an artist in her own way. To her the ink was life, the quill her weapon. And yet when art becomes deceit, the artist perishes by her own design. She could not bear her truth to be written, so she chose to erase herself instead. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I sometimes wonder, Watson, how thin the line truly is between the hand that writes and the hand that kills. I studied him for a moment, the firelight catching the faintest trace of fatigue beneath his eyes. There was something profoundly human in his melancholy, something that bound him, despite his brilliance, to the world he so often dissected from afar. The clock chimed 1. Holmes stirred, the shadow of reflection giving way to his habitual briskness. Enough philosophy for one evening. The world must turn, and so must we. Tomorrow there will be another puzzle, another restless mind to measure. But tonight, Watson, we shall let London sleep with one fewer poison in its inkpot. He rose, drew the curtains, and extinguished the lamp, leaving only the fading glow of the fire to dance upon the walls. As I made my way to my room, I heard him softly tuning his violin again, each note falling like a whisper into the night. And as the melody drifted through the quiet of Baker Street, I found myself reflecting upon the woman whose artistry had become her undoing, the hand that wrote beauty in deception and death in beauty. Holmes had unmasked her crime, but even he, I think, could not help but mourn the brilliance that had consumed itself. When morning came, the light broke pale and uncertain over the rooftops. Holmes was already at his desk, the newspaper spread before him. He glanced up as I entered. "Lestrade telegraphed," he said simply. "They found no family, no past that can be traced. Eleanor Vale was, it seems, a name borrowed from silence. She has left the world as she entered it, an enigma." He folded the paper, his tone softening. "Perhaps that is as she wished." And with that Sherlock Holmes struck a match, touched it to the corner of her notebook, and watched as the pages curled and blackened into ash. The faint scent of burnt paper filled the air, a final requiem for the woman who had written her fate in poisoned ink. Neither of us spoke as the last ember faded. Holmes turned to the window, his gaze lost somewhere in the grey London morning, and I understood that though the case had ended, its shadow would linger, etched not upon the streets or the record of the yard, but in the quiet places of his mind where mystery and melancholy met. The following morning dawned grey and brittle, the kind of morning that seemed to drain the colour from the very air. I found Holmes seated precisely where I had left him the night before, at the window unmoving, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The remnants of the burnt notebook still lay in the hearth, a fragile dust that stirred with every faint draught. For a moment I wondered whether he had slept at all. His eyes were fixed upon the street, but I knew they were seeing something far beyond it. Without turning, he said quietly, "You observe, Watson, that the case is not yet concluded." I blinked in surprise. "Not concluded? But Holmes, Miss Vale is dead, her guilt established beyond doubt. What remains?" He shifted slightly, his tone sharpening with that old familiar precision. "Facts remain, my dear fellow. We have the how and who, but the why, the true cause, still hides in shadow. You forget the unfinished letter upon Sir Reginald's desk. Its final words, "If you value your life as I value truth, you must—" They were not addressed to Miss Vale. She silenced him before the message could be sent. The intended recipient, therefore, must still exist and may yet be in danger. That pronouncement sent a chill through me. Holmes rose abruptly, his movements animated now, purposeful. The ashes of Miss Vale's confession cannot tell us everything. There remains a third player, unseen and unaccounted for. We shall find them, Watson, before they meet the same fate as Sir Reginald. He turned to the desk and drew from his pocket the small silver pen we had found in Vale's lodgings. The same make, though subtly different from Brooks. "Do you recall this?" he asked. The nib bears a faint engraving on "To R.B. with admiration." Curious, is it not? A token of esteem, yet found in the possession of his murderer. Then it was a gift from her to him, I suggested. Or from another altogether, Holmes replied. A circle of letters, a society of writers, men and women who traded influence, envy, and flattery as currency. Such gifts often conceal more than they reveal. I mean to uncover precisely who presented this pen and why. Within the hour we were once more en route to St. James's Square, the hansom cab rattling through the narrow streets as the fog lifted in slow, reluctant swirls. The Blackwell Literary Society loomed ahead, its facade austere against the pale light. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued, its members still reeling from the scandal of Brooks' death. Lionel Greaves received us with visible strain. "You return so soon, Mr. Holmes. I trust you have resolved the matter." "Resolution," Holmes said lightly, "is a term that should never precede verification. Tell me, Mr. Greaves, among Sir Reginald's correspondence, was there one to whom he showed particular regard or suspicion?" Greaves hesitated, glancing toward the closed study door. "He did speak often of a Mr. Aubrey Linton, though not always favorably. Linton is a novelist of some reputation, though his work leans toward scandal. They quarreled, I believe, over an accusation of plagiarism." Holmes's expression brightened with that peculiar gleam of interest. Plagiarism, the quiet venom of the literary world, and Miss Vale's name was known to Linton, perhaps? "I cannot say," Greaves murmured, "but she attended several gatherings under a pseudonym. E. Vale, of course, was known only through her published essays. She was by reputation an elusive woman." Holmes paced slowly, his keen gaze drifting toward a large portrait that hung above the fireplace. Sir Reginald Brooke, depicted with quill in hand, and an almost ironic serenity about his mouth. Beneath it rested a small cabinet of silver pens, each bearing an inscription. He leaned in, inspecting them one by one. "Curious indeed," he murmured. "Every member of this society, it seems, receives such a pen upon induction. See the identical craftwork, the fine ridges upon the grip, the hallmark of a single artisan. Yet here, this one is missing. The case bears the name Aubrey Linton, though his pen is absent." Greaves paled. "Surely you do not suspect—" "I suspect only that his pen may have been employed in a matter quite other than writing." Holmes straightened and turned toward the door. "Come, Watson. We must pay a visit to this Mr. Linton before ink and motive dry alike." Linton's residence lay in Bloomsbury, a tall and untidy building whose windows were half obscured by climbing ivy. We were admitted by a dishevelled servant who led us to a dimly lit study. The man himself, a slender figure with sharp features and a restless manner, rose to greet us, though the smile he offered was strained. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume. Your reputation precedes you." "And yours precedes you by half a scandal, I am told," Holmes replied smoothly. "We come concerning Sir Reginald Brooke." Linton's eyes flickered, an involuntary betrayal that did not escape Holmes. A dreadful business. The man was a critic without mercy. "Criticism," said Holmes mildly, "is seldom fatal, unless, of course, it touches upon the truth." He moved about the room with apparent indifference, yet I noted how his gaze lingered upon the writing desk, the ink bottle, and a stack of neatly tied manuscripts. "Tell me, Mr. Linton, when last did you see Sir Reginald alive?" 3 days before his death. We met briefly at the society. He accused me of borrowing certain phrases from his essays. Ridiculous, of course. I told him so. "And Miss Eleanor Vale, did you know her?" The novelist hesitated. "Only by repute. A talented writer, I believe." "I never had the pleasure." Holmes turned toward him suddenly, eyes narrowing. "Strange, then, that your name appears twice in her notebook. once beside a chemical formula and again beneath a passage marked "Final Letter." How do you account for that, Mr. Linton? The colour drained from the man's face. I can't imagine. You must be mistaken. Holmes's voice dropped to a silken whisper. I rarely am. He stepped closer, his tone soft yet edged with iron. You were her accomplice. The poison she employed was no invention of her own. It was supplied, refined, and tested by you. When she failed to destroy Brooke's letter completely, she turned that same ink upon herself, rather than face exposure. And now you fear her final message may reach its intended recipient. You, Linton's composure shattered. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of his desk. No, it was her doing, her madness. You only provided the means, Holmes said sharply. You cloaked her crime in chemistry and called it art. The man's breath came raggedly. He glanced toward the window as if gauging escape, but Holmes's gaze held him frozen. Watson, he said calmly, if you would be so kind as to summon Inspector Lestrade. I believe Mr. Linton will not leave his house again for some time. As I moved toward the door, Linton sagged into his chair, his hands trembling. She said the ink was perfect, he muttered hoarsely. She said no one would ever know. Holmes's reply was soft, almost weary. There is no ink, Mr. Linton, that can obscure guilt. It bleeds through sooner or later. When we departed, the air outside seemed cleaner, the sky faintly brightening as the morning fog thinned. Holmes paused at the gate, glancing back at the house. The silent pen, Watson, he said thoughtfully. It wrote no confession, yet told all we needed to know. 2 hands guided it, hers and his, and both now rest still. He drew his coat close, the faintest smile touching his lips. Come, my dear fellow. There remains a report to be written, and perhaps a cup of coffee strong enough to revive the living. And with that, we stepped once more into the awakening streets of London, leaving behind the last trace of poisoned ink and human folly, though I sensed even then that Holmes's thoughts lingered still upon the tragedy of words too dangerous to be written. We returned to Baker Street beneath a sky heavy with mist, that dim, unfeeling light peculiar to London in the early afternoon. Holmes was unusually quiet during our drive. His long fingers drummed against the leather seat, his gaze distant yet alive with the quiet intensity that always accompanied the completion, or near completion, of a great deduction. I had learned long ago that these moments of silence were not idleness, but the final arrangement of mental pieces into order. Still, something in his expression suggested unease, as though one thread of the tapestry yet hung loose. When we arrived, Holmes threw off his coat and paced before the fire. A fascinating study in moral decay, Watson, he murmured, and yet incomplete. I sat opposite him, weary from the morning's work but eager for the conclusion. Incomplete. You have the culprit. Linton confessed to his part in the crime, and Miss Vale's suicide stands as its grim testament. What more remains? Holmes paused, his gaze shifting toward the window as though he saw the truth written somewhere beyond the fog. Confession, my dear Watson, is a delicate thing. Men confess to what suits them, to what lessens their burden of guilt. But there is something in Linton's words that rings hollow. He claims to have refined the poison for Miss Vale's ink, but his tone was that of a man cornered, not convicted by conscience. He fears the noose, yes, but not the truth. That difference troubles me, I frowned. Then you suspect there was yet another hand in the affair. Not merely another hand, Holmes said softly. Another mind. He turned suddenly, the familiar spark of deduction igniting in his eyes. Think, Watson. The letter Brooke was writing before his death, its opening words, the urgency of its tone. It was not a personal correspondence. It was a warning. But to whom? The letter was never posted. The envelope was blank, unaddressed. It follows that the intended recipient was close at hand, someone within the society, perhaps even one who stood to gain from Brooke's silence. Before I could respond, there came a firm knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a sealed note upon a silver tray. "Delivered just now, Mr. Holmes," she said. "By a young messenger lad, said it was of importance." Holmes took the envelope and examined it carefully. The seal was stamped with the emblem of the Blackwell Literary Society, a quill crossed with a laurel. He broke it open, and as he read, the muscles in his jaw tightened. Without a word, he handed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, There are matters concerning Sir Reginald Brooke's death which you have not yet perceived. If you would know the whole truth, come alone to the Society's library at midnight. Burn this letter. A friend of the late Sir Reginald. Holmes's lips curved into that thin, mirthless smile that always heralded danger. Midnight at the Society, eh? Whoever wrote this believes they can outmaneuver me. Very well, Watson. We shall see what their stagecraft amounts to. You mean to go then? I asked, though the answer was already plain, most certainly, but not alone as our mysterious correspondent commands. You will accompany me, though you will remain unseen. The author of this note expects to find me vulnerable. I intend to disappoint them. The remainder of the day passed in uneasy anticipation. Holmes moved with restless precision, checking his revolver, packing his magnifying lens and pocket lantern. As the hour approached, we departed under a moonless sky, the streets slick with recent rain. The Society building loomed dark and silent when we arrived, its great oak doors unlocked, as though awaiting us. Inside, the air was cold and stale, and our footsteps echoed in the marble corridor. Holmes raised his lantern, the thin beam of light cutting through the gloom. "Keep behind me, Watson," he whispered, "and do not speak until I do." We entered the library, a vast chamber lined with shelves, the scent of leather and dust heavy in the air. A single lamp burned upon the central table, its light falling upon a neat stack of papers and an open ledger. Holmes approached, examining the scene with swift precision. "A staged invitation," he murmured. "Every detail prepared. The question is whether it was meant for instruction or destruction." A faint creak broke the silence. I turned sharply, too late. The heavy door behind us swung shut with a resonant thud. From the shadows a voice spoke. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes. Admirable, though I had not expected you to bring company." A tall figure stepped into the lamplight. It was Lionel Greaves, the secretary of the Society. His normally timid face was pale and drawn, but his eyes glittered with a strange intensity. Holmes regarded him coolly. "So the friend of the late Sir Reginald reveals himself. Tell me, Mr. Greaves, do you find deceit easier when written or spoken?" Greaves smiled faintly. "You think me a liar. Perhaps I am, but the truth is more dangerous than you imagine. Brooke's death was necessary. He had grown reckless. Reckless in what respect?" Holmes's tone was mild, but his gaze never left the man. "In conscience," Greaves said bitterly. "He meant to expose us all. Do you think Miss Vale and Linton were the only ones who profited from his silence? No. Brooke had unearthed evidence that the Society's funds were being misused, that manuscripts were being sold abroad under false names. He meant to denounce the entire board. I merely ensured he could not. You," I exclaimed before I could stop myself. "Then it was you who poisoned the ink?" Greaves laughed, a short, broken sound. "No, Doctor. That was Miss Vale's doing, though she believed she acted for love. I merely gave her the opportunity. I told her Brooke intended to ruin Linton's career. I knew she would act, and when she did, she took the blame that should have been mine." Holmes's voice was cold as steel, a manipulation most devilish in its simplicity. "You set one against the other and watched the result. And when the ink turned to poison, you washed your hands of the matter." Greaves stepped closer, the lamplight catching the sweat upon his brow. "You understand, then, why I summoned you. The others, those who shared my guilt, mean to see me silenced as well. They fear your meddling, Holmes. They fear exposure. They will come tonight." Before Holmes could reply, there was a sound, a sudden scraping from the corridor, followed by the muffled slam of another door. Holmes turned sharply, extinguished the lamp and drew his revolver. "Down, Watson," he hissed. A shot rang out, splintering the wooden shelves behind us. Another followed, echoing through the chamber. We dropped behind the great oak table as the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Holmes moved like lightning. He rolled toward the far end of the room, raised his weapon and fired once. A cry answered, a man's voice sharp and pained. Then silence. When he relit the lamp, the scene was chaos. Overturned chairs, shattered glass, and Lionel Greaves lying motionless upon the floor, a dark stain spreading across his waistcoat. Holmes bent over him, checking the pulse. "Alive," he said shortly, "but not for long. Fetch Lestrade at once, Watson. Tell him to bring men, armed ones. The true puppeteers are still within these walls." And as I hurried into the corridor, heart pounding, I heard Holmes's voice behind me, low, grim, and certain. The affair of the silent pen is not yet written to its end. The corridor stretched before me, dark and echoing, the gas lamps flickering weakly as if uncertain whether to hold their light. My footsteps, hurried but cautious, sounded unnaturally loud in that oppressive silence. Somewhere behind me, faintly, came the murmur of Holmes's voice and the rasp of movement. He was not alone in that library. Of that much I was certain. I reached the outer door and flung it open, drawing in a breath of cold, blessed air. The street outside was deserted, save for a hansom cab idling by the curb. I hailed the driver, pressing a coin into his hand. "Scotland Yard, Inspector Lestrade at once," I urged. The man nodded and whipped the reins, vanishing into the mist. I turned back toward the building, the heavy silence of it looming like a tomb. Something compelled me to return, not duty alone, but the knowledge that Holmes, whatever his brilliance, was now in grave peril. As I crept back through the corridor, I caught the faintest echo of footsteps above. Then, a soft groan, followed by the unmistakable scrape of furniture being dragged. The sound came not from the library, but from the floor above it. I drew my revolver and ascended the staircase, careful to keep to the shadows. The hall above was dim, lined with portraits of long-dead patrons, their painted eyes seeming to follow my every move. From behind a half-open door spilled a weak light. I edged closer and peered inside. What I saw froze me where I stood. 2 men were bent over a large oak chest, their faces half lit by a lantern. One of them I recognized instantly, Mr. Harrington, the Society's treasurer. The other, a broad-shouldered man in a workman's coat, was unfamiliar. Between them lay bundles of papers, sealed envelopes and ledgers, the Society's records, I realized at once. They were hurriedly stuffing them into a canvas bag. "Quickly now," Harrington hissed. "We must be gone before Greaves talks. If Holmes has guessed even half of it, the Yard will be on us by dawn." The other man grunted, shoving a ledger into the bag. "And Greaves? What of him? Dead, I hope," Harrington said flatly. "If not, he soon will be. I told Vance to finish the business. I did not wait to hear more." My mind reeled with the implication. The corruption Brooke had uncovered went deeper than we imagined. These men were not merely thieves. They were the architects of his death. I withdrew silently, meaning to warn Holmes. But before I could descend, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. I struggled, elbowing backward, and the grip loosened just long enough for me to turn and find myself staring into the grim, familiar face of Inspector Lestrade. "Easy, Doctor," he whispered. "Your cabman fetched me, and I brought men through the back. Holmes told you to fetch help, did he not?" I nodded, relief flooding through me. "Upstairs, Harrington and another man. They're destroying evidence." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Right then. You take the stairs with me, quietly now." We advanced together, revolvers drawn. The faint murmur of voices continued within the room, unaware of our approach. Then Lestrade gave a sharp signal, and his men burst through the door. The crash of boots, the shout of surprise, and the scuffle that followed seemed to last an eternity. When it ended, both men lay disarmed and bound, Harrington pale and trembling. At that moment Holmes appeared in the doorway below, his coat disheveled, a streak of blood along his temple where a bullet had grazed him. His eyes, however, burned with fierce clarity. "I see you've saved me the trouble, Lestrade," he said dryly. "Excellent timing, as ever," Lestrade frowned. "We've 2 of them, but I gather there's more." "Indeed," Holmes replied, descending the stairs. "The man who fired upon us below, Vance, escaped through the service corridor. He will not go far. He is wounded, and I have already sent word to the constable at the corner to block the alley. But Harrington, here he will be most instructive." Harrington glared at Holmes with something between hatred and fear. "I think you've won," he spat. "You've no proof of murder." "None," Holmes smiled faintly. "Proof, my dear sir, is a matter of construction. You and your associates conspired to defraud the Society, embezzling its funds and selling stolen manuscripts abroad. When Sir Reginald Brooke discovered the truth, you sought to silence him. You enlisted Miss Vale's misplaced affection for Linton, feeding her lies that Brooke meant to destroy them both. She, in her despair, laced the ink, a subtle toxin known only to chemists of considerable training. Yet she was no chemist. You provided her the substance under pretense of assisting her work. It was, in short, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation and cowardice. Harrington's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Lestrade stepped forward. "That's quite enough for me. You'll tell the rest at the yard." As the constables led the prisoners away, Holmes sank into a chair, his expression momentarily weary. I approached him, concerned. "You're hurt," I said quietly. He waved me off. "A scratch, nothing more. But the affair itself, Watson, it is one of the blackest chapters in human duplicity I have encountered. The mind recoils from the cold precision of it." I poured him a measure of brandy, which he accepted absently. "What of Greaves?" I asked. Holmes' expression darkened. "He lives for now. His wound is grave." Yet he spoke one final word before losing consciousness. "Ledger." It was the key. Harrington and his men intended to destroy it tonight, knowing it contained the record of every transaction they had falsified. "Thanks to you, Watson. That evidence is now preserved." I felt a flicker of pride, quickly tempered by the memory of the night's violence. "And Linton?" "What becomes of him?" "Linton's confession will be reconsidered," Holmes said. "He was but a pawn, as was Miss Vale. When the Crown has heard my account, his punishment shall be mitigated. As for Miss Vale, her tragedy lies beyond any court's reach." We sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling softly between us. The dawn light began to creep through the curtains, pale and cold. Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. "There is something peculiarly dreadful, Watson, in a crime born not of passion but of intellect, a mind turned upon itself, using reason as its instrument of ruin. Tonight, we have seen such a mind laid bare." I nodded, but my thoughts lingered on the faces of those who had fallen, Brooke, Vale, and even the trembling Greaves, caught between guilt and fear. Holmes rose at last, his energy returning with that familiar quickness. "Come, my dear fellow," he said briskly, reaching for his hat. "The day begins, and there is still one final task before the curtain falls. We must see to the recovery of the missing manuscripts, and perhaps over breakfast I shall tell you the curious story of how a drop of ink unmasked a conspiracy." And as we stepped into the cold light of morning, I could not help but feel that once again Holmes had peered into the darkest corners of human deceit, and drawn from them a grim, unforgettable truth. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in the soft haze of early dawn, our hansom cab rattling through the near-empty streets like some weary phantom of the night before. The city was stirring slowly, chimney smoke curling above the rooftops as milkmen and street sweepers went about their morning rituals. I remember thinking that London, for all its restless life, seemed oblivious to the evil that had unfolded in its heart only hours earlier. Holmes sat across from me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon nothing in particular. I had seen that look before, a strange mingling of satisfaction and fatigue that came only after the mental storm of a case had spent itself. When we entered the familiar sitting room, Mrs. Hudson had already prepared breakfast and expressed her usual maternal concern over the blood on Holmes's temple. He brushed aside her protests with characteristic indifference, seated himself at the table, and began to eat with the calm precision of a man who had just completed an experiment. I poured myself a cup of tea, still unsettled by the previous night's events. "Holmes," I said at length, "I cannot help but wonder whether we have truly reached the end of this dreadful affair. You spoke of a missing manuscript. Surely that has some bearing, yet unresolved." He looked up, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "My dear Watson, your instinct serves you well as ever. Indeed, there remains a final knot to untangle. Harrington's confession, as valuable as it is, left one curious omission. He made no mention of the second ledger." "The second ledger?" I echoed. "Precisely. The primary book contained the falsified accounts for the Society's funds, but Brooke's private research notes, those which might have proven his discovery and exposed their entire scheme, were kept separately. They have not been recovered. Harrington spoke of their destruction, yet I am not convinced. He is too cautious a man to burn what might later serve as leverage. I believe, Watson, that the missing papers are still within London's grasp." He rose suddenly and crossed to the mantel, where the morning paper lay folded. "Observe," he continued, tapping a column with his forefinger, "a small notice in the Times. Auction of rare manuscripts to be held at Russell's Antiquarian Rooms noon today. The timing is most convenient, is it not?" I leaned forward to read the brief advertisement. You suspect that these papers, Brooks' work, will appear there. I do more than suspect it, said Holmes, his eyes gleaming. I know it. The name Russell is but a front. The true proprietor is none other than Bernard Hale, a known intermediary for contraband documents. Harrington would have arranged such a sale in advance, should his plan have failed. It is the sort of foresight that marks a man of criminal intelligence. Within the hour, we were en route to Bloomsbury. The streets had grown busy, the fog lifting as London came alive with the day. Holmes, dressed in his grey travelling coat and broad-brimmed hat, spoke little, though I could sense the tension tightening in his frame. It was not excitement but concentration, a mental precision sharpened to a fine edge. When we arrived at the auction house, the scene within was one of quiet civility. Scholars, collectors, and booksellers murmured among the rows of seats, while on a raised platform a clerk arranged items for display. The air smelled faintly of parchment and dust. Holmes took a seat midway down the aisle, his eyes never leaving the small side door through which consignments were carried in. The auction began in the usual manner, with bids on minor antiquities and obscure pamphlets. Holmes watched, silent and still. Then, near the close of the session, the clerk produced a thin leather folio bound with a crimson ribbon. Lot 47, he announced. Private papers. Anonymous author, believed late 19th century. Subject, treatises on chemical analysis with marginalia. Holmes' eyes flashed. The hand, Watson. The description matches Brooks' own writing. Note the discipline. Chemical analysis and the anonymity meant to conceal the origin. Without hesitation, he raised his paddle. The bidding opened modestly, but soon grew competitive. Across the room, a heavy-set man with a scarred cheek entered the contest, his demeanor far too intent for a mere collector. Holmes's expression hardened. "Vance," he murmured. So he escaped the constable's net after all. The game resumes. The bidding war reached a fevered pitch, yet Holmes remained cool, offering precise increments until at last the gavel fell in his favor. Sold, to the gentleman in grey. We collected the folio and made swiftly for the exit, but before we reached the door, a commotion broke out behind us. Vance had risen from his seat, his hand buried within his coat. I glimpsed the gleam of metal. In an instant, Holmes shoved me aside, and the shot rang out, splintering a wooden pillar inches from where we stood. Panic erupted in the hall. Holmes darted through the crowd with the agility of a cat, and within moments had tackled the man to the ground. Lestrade, who had followed us discreetly from Baker Street, appeared just in time to assist. The struggle was brief. Vance, cursing, was dragged to his feet, his revolver clattering to the floor. "You'll hang for this, Holmes," he spat. "On the contrary," Holmes said coldly, dusting off his coat. "It is you who will hang, for conspiracy to murder and for the attempted destruction of a man's legacy." Once the prisoner was secured, we returned to Baker Street under Lestrade's escort. The folio lay between us in the cab, its ribbon unbroken. Holmes regarded it with quiet reverence. "This, Watson," he said softly, "is more than mere paper. It is justice for a man who sought only to serve truth." Back at our lodgings, he spread the pages across the desk. Each sheet was covered in Brooks' neat, slanted hand, annotated with precise chemical formulas and meticulous observations. Holmes turned the final page, revealing a single line written in darker ink. "To uncover falsehood is the duty of every honest mind, though the ink that writes it may be one's undoing." Holmes read the line aloud, then closed the folio. "Brooke foresaw his end," he said quietly. "He knew his discovery endangered powerful men, and yet he persisted. It is a curious parallel, is it not, Watson? The very instrument of his work, the ink, became the means of his death." I nodded solemnly. "There is something profoundly tragic in it." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Tragic, yes, but also instructive. For every villain who wields intellect for malice, there exists one who wields it for truth. Brooke, though slain, has triumphed." He drew back his chair and lit his pipe, the room filling with the familiar blue haze. "And now," he added with a touch of his old levity, "I believe I have earned a brief respite from the world's perplexities. Until the next case, Watson, we may yet enjoy a moment's peace, though I confess experience has taught me such peace rarely endures." I smiled at that, knowing all too well the truth of it. For even as the morning sunlight warmed the sitting room, I sensed that somewhere in London's depths another mystery was already taking shape, and that Sherlock Holmes, Restless sentinel of reason would soon be called again to unravel it. The fire had burned low, casting a warm but unsteady glow upon the walls of Baker Street. Holmes sat silent for a long while, the recovered manuscript resting beside him, its crimson ribbon now carefully retied. Outside, the muffled rattle of carriages faded into the hum of the city, awakening once more. But within that familiar sitting room, a peculiar stillness held sway. I watched him from the opposite chair, uncertain whether to speak. His face was calm, yet his eyes betrayed that inward turbulence which only the resolution of a great case could provoke. Relief mingled with the faint dissatisfaction of a mind already turning toward the next enigma. At last, he stirred. "Watson," he said quietly, "have you ever considered how often the pursuit of truth leaves behind more wreckage than the lie itself?" I hesitated. "You speak of Brooke?" "Among others," he replied, leaning forward. "Brooke, Vale, even that pitiful fellow Linton, they are casualties of intellect misdirected, of conscience entangled in pride and fear. And yet I cannot condemn Brooke entirely. He glimpsed a truth greater than himself, a discovery that would have exposed corruption on a scale vast enough to shake institutions. The tragedy lies in how that truth was silenced." He rose and began pacing the room, his hands clasped behind him. The grey dawn filtering through the curtains lent him an austere air, like a scholar meditating over some unfathomable theorem. "There is something unfinished here, Watson," he murmured. "The recovery of Brooke's papers restores his honor, yes, but it does not explain the source of the poison that killed him. Miss Vale possessed neither the knowledge nor the means to procure such a compound. Harrington supplied it, that much is clear, but through whom? He was no chemist. He could not have prepared so subtle a toxin unaided." I frowned. "You believe there was yet another accomplice?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. A shadow behind the curtain. The handwriting of intellect is always distinct, and in this case I perceive its trace. You recall the faint scent I detected upon the ink bottle, a bitterness akin to burnt almonds masked beneath resin?" "Yes, distinctly," I replied. "That odor belongs to a compound derived from prussic acid," he said. "Now there are only 3 laboratories in London capable of producing it in stable form, and 2 are under government contract. The 3rd belongs to a certain Professor Aldous Hereford, once a respected chemist, dismissed from the Royal College for unethical experimentation. His name appeared in Brooke's correspondence some years ago, though only once and in passing. I suspect that connection is not as casual as it appears. Before I could respond, there came a brisk knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon a small tray. Holmes tore it open and scanned its contents swiftly. His expression sharpened. "As I thought. Lestrade has just wired from the Yard. Harrington has spoken. He claims the poison came from a foreign specialist, but the address he gave corresponds precisely to Hereford's old lodgings in Wapping." The man has resurfaced. Without another word, Holmes seized his coat and hat. "Come, Watson. It seems the affair of the silent pen has one final page yet to be written. The journey to Wapping took us through the narrowing lanes of the East End, where the morning fog still clung low over the river. The air smelled of tar and salt, and the cries of dock workers echoed faintly through the mist. Holmes guided our cab through the warren of streets, with unerring direction, until we reached a decaying row of warehouses, overlooking the Thames. The building in question was a derelict brick structure, with boarded windows and a rusted sign reading, "A. Hereford and Cummers Chemical Importers." A faint light glimmered through a crack in the shutters. Holmes gestured for silence and drew a small pistol from his pocket. "We shall enter quietly," he whispered. Inside, the air was thick with chemical fumes and the faint hiss of boiling liquid. The chamber was cluttered with retorts, flasks, and instruments, yet it was clear that someone had been working here recently. At the far end, a figure in a long coat bent over a table, a lamp casting his gaunt features into stark relief. "Professor Hereford, I believe." Holmes's voice cut through the stillness. The man straightened sharply, turning toward us with wild eyes. His hair was white and unkempt, his hands stained dark with chemical residue. "Who are you?" "How dare you intrude?" "I am Sherlock Holmes," said my companion evenly. "And you, sir, have been dealing in substances far more deadly than your license allows. The poison that killed Sir Reginald Brooke was of your making. Hereford's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. So Harrington talked. I might have known. The man was a fool. But you are mistaken, Mr. Holmes. I did not kill Brooke. I merely sold what was asked of me. Science is neutral. It serves both good and evil depending on the hand that wields it. Holmes took a slow step forward, his gaze piercing. A convenient philosophy, Professor. Yet you knew to whom you sold it and for what purpose. Brooke's death financed your continued experiments, did it not? Hereford's expression faltered, and in that instant he lunged for the table. Holmes sprang after him, but the chemist's hand closed around a flask of amber liquid. "One more step and I'll spill it," he cried. "A single drop, and this room will fill with gas enough to kill us all." Holmes froze, eyes locked on the trembling flask. "Then your death will be the final proof of your guilt," he said softly. For only a man conscious of his crime fears its exposure. Hereford's hand shook, the flask glinting in the dim light. Then, with a strangled sound, he lowered it slowly to the table and sank into the chair behind him, his defiance collapsing into weary resignation. "I never meant for the man to die," he murmured. "Harrington told me it was for research, some ink preservative for archival use. I suspected otherwise, but I was desperate. They threatened to ruin me if I refused." Holmes nodded grimly. "And so you became their accomplice." "You see, Watson," he added, turning toward me, "there is no crime so small that intellect cannot corrupt it into something monstrous. A man may justify anything when pride and desperation are his masters." We left the warehouse in silence, Hereford in custody of Lestrade's men who had followed at Holmes's prior request. The fog had lifted, revealing the glimmer of the river beneath the rising sun. Holmes paused at the edge of the dock, gazing across the water. "It is finished now," I said quietly. He shook his head. "Finished perhaps in law, but not in consequence. The poison, the ink, the lies. They form a chain of reason twisted upon itself. Brooke sought truth through science, and others used that same science for deceit. The line between them is perilously thin, Watson. One must tread carefully, lest the pursuit of knowledge lead once more to ruin." We returned to Baker Street later that afternoon, weary but thoughtful. Holmes stood by the window, watching the clouds drift across the pale sky. Then, with a faint smile, he turned to me. "You may title your account as you please, my dear fellow," he said. "But let the world remember this. Sometimes the quietest voices leave the deepest mark. A pen may fall silent, yet its words continue to echo in eternity. And so it was that the affair of the silent pen came to its solemn conclusion, not with triumph, but with understanding. For in the great ledger of human reason, as Holmes once said, every truth demands its reckoning, and every silence conceals a story waiting to be heard. Evening had settled over London once again, that peculiar hour when the lamplighter's glow turned the fog into a living thing, shifting and whispering along Baker Street. I sat by the hearth, recording the final notes of the affair in my journal, while Holmes stood near the window, a faint silhouette against the dim street beyond. The events of the past days had left their mark upon us both. His frame seemed leaner, his eyes shadowed by thought, but the air around him carried that unmistakable energy of resolution, the calm after intellectual storm. For some time, he remained motionless, staring out into the fog. Then, with that quiet deliberation I had come to know so well, he turned back to me. "Watson," he said, "there is a peculiar satisfaction in reaching the end of a case, but I confess, this one leaves behind a bitter residue. The logic was perfect, the chain of evidence unbroken, yet I find no joy in its completion." I closed my notebook. "You mean because of the deaths?" He nodded slightly. "Because of the silence, rather. So many voices extinguished. Brooke, Vale, even Harrington's moral voice drowned by greed. Each played their part, yet none understood the full measure of the design until it was too late. Knowledge, like fire, Watson, gives light only so long as it is kept in careful hands." He crossed to the sideboard, poured himself a measure of brandy, and stood warming it in his hand. The lamplight caught the faint scar at his temple, a lingering souvenir of that night at the library. "Still," he continued, "one last thread of this tapestry remains unwoven." I looked up sharply. "Another?" "Not of crime," he said, "but of consequence. I received a letter this morning from the executors of Brooke's estate. It appears he left behind a sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, It was discovered among his private effects at the Society's offices. He drew a small envelope from his pocket, yellowed with age, the wax seal unbroken. My curiosity was instantly piqued. "You mean to open it now?" "Indeed. We have earned that much, I think." He broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of thick paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Brooks, firm, elegant, and deliberate. Holmes read aloud in a steady tone, "If ever these papers should fall into your hands, Mr. Holmes, it will mean that truth has once more triumphed over deceit. Yet I fear the victory will be hollow. Know this, the discovery for which I labored was not merely of ink or formula, but of principle, that words may be made incorruptible. I sought to preserve knowledge beyond the decay of time and corruption of men. If this ideal has brought about my undoing, then let it serve as a warning, that in the pursuit of permanence, we must not forget the impermanence of conscience." Holmes lowered the letter slowly, his gaze distant. "There is a peculiar irony there, Watson. The man sought to make his words eternal, and in dying he succeeded. His ink may have been poisoned, but his message remains untarnished." We sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. Outside, the sounds of the city drifted faintly, the rattle of wheels, the cry of a newsboy, the laughter of distant pedestrians. At last Holmes spoke again, his tone lighter but no less reflective. "Do you recall, Watson, that night at the Society when you found Lestrade's men binding Harrington? You acted with commendable courage, though I dare say you never expected the danger to carry you so near the heart of the matter." I smiled modestly. "I had no time to think of danger. My only concern was to reach you before harm befell." He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "A loyal impulse, and one I have counted upon more times than I care to admit. Indeed, without your timely intervention, those papers might well have perished in the flames. You have a curious knack for being precisely where reason needs heart." "Thank you, Holmes," I said, somewhat moved, "though I fancy that reason, unaided, would have managed quite well on its own." He chuckled softly. "Perhaps. Yet every mind, however acute, requires a steadying hand at times. Even I am not immune to misjudgment. I had thought the affair concluded when Harrington was taken. It was only your question about the missing manuscript that reopened the path to Hereford's laboratory. You see, Watson, deduction may reveal truth, but it is persistence that ensures it endures." His tone, though tinged with irony, carried genuine warmth. I have often said that Holmes's admiration was rare, and therefore of immense value. To receive it was to know that one had, however briefly, met the impossible standards of his intellect. He moved to his violin, lifted it from its stand and began to play a slow, wistful melody that drifted through the room like smoke. The sound filled the quiet space between us, carrying something of Brooks' melancholy and the subtle tragedy that lingered behind every solved case. As he played, I found myself thinking of Miss Vale, of how love and deception had entangled her fate, and of the strange poetry of Brooks' dying message. In that moment, the case seemed less an investigation than a lament for human frailty. When at last Holmes lowered the bow, the final note hung trembling in the air before fading into silence. "There, Watson," he said softly. "Music, unlike words, requires no preservation. It lives and dies in the instant, leaving memory as its only witness. Perhaps that is the truest form of incorruptibility." I regarded him with quiet admiration. "You speak like a philosopher tonight." "Only a detective grown weary of crime," he replied with a faint smile. "But fear not, my friend. The city will not long allow me such indulgence. Even now I can feel the whisper of some fresh perplexity rising from its depths. When it comes, we shall be ready." He set the violin aside and took his seat once more, drawing his dressing gown about him. The fire crackled, throwing sparks that danced upon the grate. I resumed my notes, recording his reflections while the rhythm of the city beyond resumed its eternal pulse. It was near midnight when he finally spoke again, half to himself. "Strange, is it not, how even silence has a sound? The silence of a pen, of a conscience, of truth momentarily stilled. Yet somewhere, somehow, it always returns." He rose, opened the window, and let the night air in. The distant toll of St. Paul's drifted faintly through the fog, solemn and unbroken. Holmes looked out over the sleeping city, his silhouette framed against the pale gaslight. "Brooks' voice is gone," he said, "but his work remains, a testament that even in deceit truth leaves its echo. That is enough." He turned from the window then, a faint smile touching his lips, and reached for his pipe. "Come, Watson," he said. "Let us have one last pipe before bed. Tomorrow may yet bring another mystery, and after all, silence, however eloquent, cannot last forever." And as the smoke curled upward, mingling with the fading strains of his violin, I realized that the affair of the silent pen had not merely tested Holmes's reason. It had reminded us both that even the most brilliant logic is powerless without humanity to give it meaning. In that dim, flickering room, truth had spoken not through ink or evidence, but through the enduring partnership of mind and heart, a bond as indelible, perhaps, as the very words I set down that night in memory of it. The next morning broke grey and still, the fog hanging low over Baker Street, like a heavy curtain refusing to lift. Holmes sat at the table, his tea untouched, while I read through the day's papers. The Times devoted 3 columns to the conclusion of the Brooke affair, hailing Holmes as the architect of justice once again. Yet the detective seemed unmoved, his gaze lost in the slow drift of smoke from his pipe. When I remarked upon the article, he waved it aside almost impatiently. "The press, Watson, sees only the surface of things, the arrest, the confession, the convenient closure. They mistake the final stroke of the pen for the completion of truth. But you and I, my dear fellow, know that truth is rarely so obedient." I sensed that he was still unsettled, not by doubt in his deductions, but by something deeper, a moral unease that lingered after the machinery of logic had done its work. "You speak as though the case were not fully over," I ventured. "In a sense, it never is," he replied. "Every resolution leaves an echo. Tell me, what do you suppose became of the formula itself, the one Brooke guarded so jealously?" "It was destroyed," I said. "The laboratory fire saw to that." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "And yet, what if destruction were not the end, but the very means by which permanence was achieved?" I stared at him. "Holmes, surely you cannot mean—" He smiled faintly, that familiar spark of mischief kindling in his eyes. "I mean only that Brooke's ideal of incorruptible knowledge may have succeeded in a manner none could foresee. Do you recall the scrap of vellum recovered from Hereford's safe, the one you assumed to be a draft of his confession?" "Yes, of course. I examined it again late last night under the lens. It was not ink, Watson. The text was etched, molecularly bonded to the fibers by an early form of chemical catalysis. In short, Brooke's imperishable ink was no longer ink at all. It had become part of the very fabric of the page. Even the flames could not consume it entirely. What we recovered from the ashes was not a fragment of confession, but the proof of his life's work, his triumph hidden within his ruin." I sat in stunned silence. "Then his goal was realized after all." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and therein lies the tragedy. He achieved immortality of thought, but at the cost of every human bond that gave his work meaning. His death was not the failure of genius, Watson, but the consequence of forgetting why genius exists." He rose then, pacing the room as though to shake off the weight of revelation. "Harrington coveted power. Vale pursued affection. Brooke sought permanence. And all 3 lost themselves to illusion. The human heart, my friend, is the one variable no formula can perfect." For a long moment neither of us spoke. The fire popped gently in the grate, casting restless light across the detective's angular features. Then, as though suddenly remembering himself, Holmes turned briskly toward his desk and drew open a drawer. From it, he withdrew a small envelope, its surface faintly scorched, yet intact. "The last remnant," he said. "I shall see it deposited at the British Museum under seal, where it may rest undisturbed. Knowledge, after all, belongs not to men, but to time." I watched as he sealed the envelope anew, pressing the wax with the back of his ring. There was something almost ceremonial in the act, as if he were closing not merely a case but a chapter of human folly. When it was done, he turned to me with that wry expression I had come to love, half amusement, half resignation. "You see, Watson, even the pursuit of eternity must bow to the simple virtue of letting go." He gestured toward the window. "Come, let us walk. The fog is lifting, and I fancy a breath of the ordinary will do us both good." We stepped out into Baker Street, the air damp and sharp with the scent of coal and rain. Cabs rattled past, the city stirring to life, oblivious to the moral reckonings of 2 solitary men. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his stride measured, his eyes thoughtful. As we reached the corner, a newsboy darted by, waving the morning edition. "Read all about it. Murder at the docks, police baffled, mystery deepens." Holmes stopped, his lips curling into that familiar predatory smile. "Ah," he murmured, taking a copy from the boy. "It appears the world has conspired to spare me from idleness yet again." He scanned the column briefly, his eyes narrowing. "Curious. Very curious indeed. Watson, I believe our morning's walk has just taken a most promising detour." I could not help but laugh. "Another mystery already?" "Another truth, rather," he corrected. "And perhaps this time one untainted by ink or ambition." He hailed a cab with a sharp whistle, the driver pulling up with a clatter. As Holmes climbed inside, he glanced back at me, the fire of purpose rekindled in his eyes. "Come, my dear doctor. There will be time enough for philosophy when the world ceases to misbehave, and I assure you, it never shall." And so we rode off through the awakening city, the fog thinning into morning light, leaving behind the ghosts of Brooke's tragedy and the echo of his final message. The case of the silent pen had closed, but the pursuit of truth, the tireless dance between reason and conscience, continued on, as inevitable and immortal as the words that would one day bear his name. For Holmes, the world would always be an unfinished manuscript, written in mystery and illuminated by deduction. And as for me, I found comfort in the simple certainty that wherever there was shadow, Sherlock Holmes would be there to read, to reason, and when all else failed, to remind mankind that truth, however silent, always finds its voice.